And the last thing we were reading was the talk of Mayyarah the Maliki. He was explaining to us a formula that was stated by Ibn Ashir the Maliki. Ibn Ashir was talking about the fact that the world couldn't have created itself because the world is itself a possibility. And a possibility is something that could exist or not exist. Existence and non-existence are equal for a possibility. Neither is more probable than the other. Neither existence nor non-existence is more probable for a possibility. They are equal to each other. So if it were existent or non-existent, it's by a preponderator. So if it were to create itself, that would mean that it became preponderant without a preponderator, which would mean then that it became heavier than what it's equal to. And that's impossible. It can't become heavier to what it's equal to. That's what we were talking about last time. And now we're going to just continue from the last thing we said. So we're still explaining the words of Ibn Ashir. Let's repeat. What did Ibn Ashir say? He said these lines of poetry here. وجوده له دليل قاطع حاجة كل محدث للصانع لو حدثت بنفسها الأكوان لاجتمع التساوي والرجحان وذا محال وحدوث العالم من حدث الأعراض مع تلازم. It means وجوده, in God's existence, له دليل قاطع, it has definitive evidence. حاجة كل محدث للصانع, the need of every event of a maker, or being in need of a maker. لو حدثت بنفسها الأكوان لاجتمع التساوي والرجحان, had created things happened by themselves, then two things that weigh the same, one of them would be heavier than the other. وَذَا مُحَالٌ, and that's impossible. وَحُدُوثُ الْعَالَمِ, and the createdness of the world. مِنْ حَدَثِ الْأَعْرَاضِ مَعَ تَلَازُمِ. Okay. فهمت. Alhamdulillah. So he says here, لما قدم في برهان الوجود تسليم حدوث العالم. So when it was that Ibn Ashir, to prove God's existence, he submitted the createdness of the world. As proof for God's existence, he submitted as proof for God's existence the createdness of the world. ذكر هنا برهان ذلك. Then here he mentioned the argument for that the world is created. Yani, he said God exists, and the proof for that is the createdness of the world. So that's an argument in itself, period. Can discuss that and stop. Or you can keep going further, which is what he did. Then he went further, because it's like, what if his opponent says, well, how do you know the world's created? You said the proof that God exists is the createdness of the world. Okay, so if the world were created, then that would be proof that God exists. But how do you know that the world is created? So then he mentioned that argument here. ذكر هنا برهان ذلك. Then here he mentioned the proof, the evidence, the argument for that the world is created. وهو ملازمته للأعراض الحادثة. And that is the units in the world, the units that make up the world, the volumes that make up the world, yani the atoms and the compounds that make up the world, being bound to created properties. فإن أجرام العالم يستحيل انفكاكها. فإن أجرام العالم يستحيل انفكاكها عن الأعراض. For indeed, the volumes within the world, it is impossible that they be separated from their properties. كالحركة والسكون, like motion and stillness. We're always going to go back to motion and stillness and connection and separation. If you want to go to four things, then you say all four. If you don't want to go to four things, just say two. Motion and stillness. Just by these two, you can prove the createdness of the world. By now, I think the formula is clear for you here. Now we're just going to read what we've been studying for time now, which is we're saying this world altogether is made of volumes and properties. And these volumes, they are created because their properties are created. And these properties, they are created by observation, which is that they come and they go. There's so many properties, so let's just boil it down to two simple ones, or maybe four if we want. We'll keep it simple for the person we want to teach and convince. Motion and stillness. So this motion is created, that's observed. The stillness is created, that's observed. And the volume that has this motion or stillness can't escape this motion or stillness, so it's created too. And then this world, which is composed of these volumes and properties, would have to be created. And that's the whole thing right there. So now he's going to say all of that. He says, فَإِنَّ أَجْرَامَ الْعَالَمِ يَسْتَحِيلٌ فِكَاكُهَا عَنِ الْأَعْرَاضِ. Indeed, the volumes that make up the world, it's impossible that they be separated from the properties. كَالْحَرَكَةِ وَالسُّكُونِ, like motion and stillness. وَهَذِهِ الْأَعْرَاضُ حَادِثَةٌ. And these properties, they are created. They are eventual. بِدَلِيلِ مُشَاهَدَةِ تَغَيُّرِهَا, as evidenced by witnessing their changing. This is why An-Nasafiyyah started by talking about sound senses. That's an evidence in itself. When we say observation, that goes back to sound senses. The proof for the createdness of these properties is observation, observing their changing, their alternating. فَلَوْ كَانَتْ قَدِيمَةً لَزِمَ أَلَّا تَنْعَدِمْ. Had they been eternal, then it would be binding that they do not vanish. لِأَنَّ مَا ثَبَتَ قِدَمُهُ اسْتَحَالَ عَدَمُهُ. Because anything confirmed to be eternal is impossible to be non-existent. That's a mental rule. ما ثبت قدمه استحال عدمه. Whatever is confirmed eternal, yani to be eternal, is impossible to be non-existent. وإذا ثبت حدوثها واستحالة وجودها في الأزل. And if it is confirmed, if their createdness is confirmed and the impossibility of them existing in eternity is confirmed, the properties we mean, لَزِمَ حُدُوثُ الْأَجْرَامِ, then binding would be also the createdness of the volumes. وَاسْتَحَالَ وُجُودُهَا فِي الْأَزَلِ قَطْعًا. And then for the volumes to exist in eternity would be impossible, definitively. Because if the volumes could exist in eternity, although its properties are not eternal, that would mean that it's possible to separate the volumes from its properties. So that's why you always want to choose some properties that the volume can never escape. Some properties maybe a volume could escape, like flavor, but some volumes can't escape. It has to be moving or still. So you want to go to one of those. So had the volumes been eternal, or even possibly eternal, then this would mean that it's valid to separate them from their properties. And that's impossible. We already proved that. So then the properties can't be eternal, nor can the volumes through which these properties exist. That's why he said, لِاسْتِحَالَةٍ فِكَاكِهَا لِاسْتِحَالَةٍ فِكَاكِهَا عَنِ الْأَعْرَاضِ. These volumes could not be eternal because of the impossibility of separating them from their properties. إذ حدوث أحد المتلازمين يستلزم حدوث الآخر ضرورة. Because the createdness of one of two alternating things, one of two alternates, or one of two alternatives, the createdness of one out of two alternatives demands the createdness of the other alternative necessarily. ولم يذكر الناظم دليل حدوث العرض لوضوحه. And the poet, he did not mention, that's Ibn Ashir, he did not mention the argument for the createdness of the properties because of its obviousness. So what did he say? وجوده له دليل قاطع. His existence, God's existence, it has definitive evidence. حاجة كل محدث للصانع. Every event's need of a maker. لو حدثت بنفسها الأكوان. Had created things happen by themselves. لاجتمع التساوي والرجحان. Then two things that weigh the same, one of them would be heavier than the other. وَذَا مُحَالٌ وَحُدُوثُ الْعَالَمِ. And that's impossible. And the createdness of the world, مِنْ حَدَثِ الْأَعْرَاضِ مَعَ تَلَازُمِ, is from the createdness of the properties with their being bound to the volumes. So he did mention the createdness of the properties, but he didn't argue for the createdness of the properties. So it's like he claimed in his line of poetry, he claimed that properties are created, and then he didn't substantiate his claim. So he claimed that God's existence has definitive evidence. And then he said, what is that evidence? Every event's need of a maker. And then he elaborated further. Had those created things happen by themselves, then two things that weigh the same, one of them would be heavier than the other, meaning then there would be an absurdity. Then an absurdity would be possible. An impossibility would be possible. وَذَا مُحَالٌ, and that's impossible. So then he did all that argument there, and that can be unpacked. And then وَحُدُوثُ الْعَالَمِ. So he told us, so the world is created then. But وَحُدُوثُ الْعَالَمِ يعني. And then he argued, he gave more argumentation for the createdness of the world. He said, it's min hadath al-a'rad. It's because of, or known by, the createdness of the properties. Okay, so that is in itself, that's a claim. So the explainer, Mayara, he says, وَلَمْ يَذْكُرِ النَّاظِمُ دَلِيلَ حُدُوثِ الْعَرَضِ. The poet, Ibn Ashir, did not mention the argument for the createdness of the properties. We did say that what it is, but he didn't elaborate. So why he didn't elaborate? لِوُضُوحِهِ, because of its obviousness, so obvious. And maybe that obviousness is for someone who has some practice in this field. And then Mayara goes on, وَالْأَكْوَانُ أَعْرَاضٌ مَخْصُوصَةٌ. And the akwan refers to particular properties. وَهِيَ الْحَرَكَةُ وَالسُّكُونُ وَالِاجْتِمَاعُ وَالِافْتِرَاقُ. Those particular properties called akwan in this science of the creed, they are motion, stillness, contact, and separation. قَالَهُ فِي شَرْحِ الْكُبْرَى. He said so in the big explanation. And he means by he, السنوسي. والمراد به في كلام الناظم والله أعلم ما هو أعم من الجوهر والعرض. Mayara says, but what the poet meant when he said al-akwan here, لو حدثت بنفسها الأكوان, had the akwan happened by themselves. Mayara saying, there's a technical meaning for akwan, those four properties, but what the author meant here is more general. He meant the linguistic meaning of akwan here. من الجوهر والعرض ومن سائر الموجودات الحادثة. He means both the entity and the property and all existing created things. ويحتمل أن يريد الأعراض المخصوصة. And it is possible though that he does indeed mean by mentioning the ekwan those particular properties كما ذكر, as specifically mentioned according to the jargon of the masters of this field. ويدخل غيرها من الأعراض وسائر الجواهر من باب لا فارق. And if he did mean those four in particular, then still the other properties and the rest of the volumes are still included from the perspective that there's no difference. والتساوي في كلام الناظم بحذف الياء للوزن. And this word at-tasawi, which I've been translating as they weigh the same, in the talk of the poet, is with an omitted ya. So the word is at-tasawi with a ya. That's the original word. Lil wazn, he omitted the ya to keep the beat. So the beat is mustaf'ilun, 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 6 times. So that's approximately, if you can hear my beat here, that's the beat. So وجوده له دليل قاطع حاجة كل محدث للصانع لو حدثت بنفسها الأكوان لاجتمع التساوي والرجحان. So here's the word here, التساوي. He had to omit the ya that would be here, the letter ya that would be here, because that would break the beat if it were there. Then we would say لاجتمع التساوي والرجحان, that breaks the beat. So the poet has license, poetic license to break the normal rules. The poet has license to break some rules because he's restricted by the meter of his poetry. So being limited by the meter of his poetry, since that tightens him, then he has some other relief. He had to squeeze into the lines of poetry, but so in order to do that, then he's allowed to, what you call, unbutton some other spots. So that yeah here is omitted, and that's fine omission there. The rules that the poet is allowed to break, his poetic license, depending on what he does, this varies in decentness. Sometimes it's very decent, and sometimes it's corny. So it has range of decentness to corniness. So at-tasawi in the composer's talk is with an omitted ya to keep the beat. وَالْعَالَمْ بِفَتْحِ اللَّامِ كُلُّ مَا سِوَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. And the word alam in the composer's lines is with a fatha on the lam. So it's not alim, it's alam. And then that means everything other than God. Exalted is He. وَالْعَرَض, and the arad بِفَتْحَتَيْن, with 2 fathas, which I translated for you as property. عند المتكلمين, according to the theologians, اسم لما لا دوام له. It's the name of something that doesn't last. So even there, that's linguistic meaning. That's correct. Yani, he said, this is what it means according to the theologians. The arad, according to the theologians, is what doesn't last. But that right there, that's the linguistic meaning of arad. Something that doesn't last. And the technical meaning of arad to the theologians is the attribute of the creation. So he gave the technical meaning, he gave the linguistic meaning as the technical meaning here. And then this linguistic meaning he gave is open to that generality that some scholars mentioned that we talked about. From there, some of these scholars, they said the created attribute doesn't last for 2 moments. And we already said our Shaykh doesn't accept that generality. That generality that they came to is based on a linguistic meaning of the word. The linguistic meaning of the word has relevance, which is that the created attribute is subject to vanishing, not that it must vanish. وَهُوَ مَا يَقُومُ بِغَيْرِهِ. And this thing that has this transient existence or this temporary existence, this property with this temporary existence, it is, and now he gives more technical definition, that which exists by extension of something else. قَالَهُ فِي الْقَامُوس. So says the author of Al-Qamus. So there, now if you know who's the author of Al-Qamus, then you know who he is. He didn't say his name. Who's that? That's Al-Fayruzabadi. وفي شرح الكبرى العرض ما كانت ذاته لا تشغل فراغا ولا له قيام بنفسه. And in the big explanation by As-Sanusi, he says, the arad, the property, is that which doesn't by itself fill a space. That which itself does not fill a space. That doesn't mean it's not in a space. It is in a space. But it's not itself filling a space, as you know, that by which it is an extension is what's filling the space. وَلَا لَهُ قِيَامٌ بِنَفْسِهِ. It doesn't fill a space itself, and it doesn't have an independent standing. وَإِنَّمَا يَكُونُ وُجُودُهُ تَابِعًا لِوُجُودِ الْجَوْهَرِ. And merely its existence would be an extension of the existence of the atom. كَالْعِلْمِ الَّذِي يَقُومُ بِالْجَوْهَرِ. Or, if it doesn't mean atom here, it means the entity, the volume. Sometimes they say jawhar and they mean a compound. Sometimes they say jawhar, they mean that single atom. That's the very technical meaning. And sometimes they say jawhar and they mean it more linguistic meaning. So then they mean an entity or some figure or object. So that's how these things go sometimes. You need to follow the context. Just like we now said, what did he mean, Ibn Ashir, by the word akwan? Did he mean the technical meaning of those 4 particular properties? Or did he mean the broad linguistic meaning? He might have meant it this way or that way. They do the same thing with Jawhar. So here he says, I now just translated Jawhar as atom, but it looks like atom is not the right way to translate it here because of what he said afterwards. So let me repeat. وَإِنَّمَا يَكُونُ وُجُودُهُ تَابِعًا لِوُجُودِ الْجَوْهَرِ. And merely this property, its existence, is by extension of the existence of an entity of some sort. Then he says, كَالْعِلْمِ, like knowledge, الَّذِي يَكُومُ بِالْجَوْهَرِ, like the knowledge that exists by extension of the entity that has it. So, yani, usually a single atom is not going to have knowledge. So it's as if then, when he said Jawhar here, he doesn't mean the single atom. He means something broader than that. وَكَالْحَرَكَةِ وَاللَّوْنِ, and like motion and color. فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَشْغَلُ فَرَاغًا. Indeed, these do not fill a space. بل الفراغ الذي شغله الجوهر قبل اتصافه بها هو الفراغ الذي شغله مع اتصافه بها من غير زيادة. Rather, the space that the volume occupied before having such a property, before being attributed with such and such property, it is the very space that it fills with being attributed with that property without any increase. So if something were, if some volume fills a space, whatever is the space it fills, and then this volume moved, that doesn't change the amount of space that it filled, although it wasn't moving before. All it did was change its location. Or if its color changed, or its smell changed, or its temperature changed, or its texture changed, all of that does not increase or decrease the amount of space that the volume is filling. Intaha, end quote.